It's my pleasure to introduce Chris Cornelius. Chris Cornelius is a citizen of the Oneida Nation, I hope I pronounced that correctly, nation of Wisconsin, and currently he's the chair of the Department of Architecture at the University of New Mexico. He is the founding principal of the studio Indigenous, a design practice serving Indigenous clients and beyond. He has served as a cultural consultant, design collaborator with Antoine Predock. He has won the AIA, he collaborated with Antoine Predock in the Indian Community School of Milwaukee. This project won the AIA Design Excellence Award from the Committee for Architecture for Education. He holds a Master of Architecture degree from the University of Virginia and a Bachelor of Science in Architecture Studies from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. He was recently the Louis Kahn Visiting Assistant Professor in Yale, and he has previously taught on the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee and the University of Virginia. He has won numerous awards. The list is too long for me to go over, but they're all significant and that reflects the value and quality of his extraordinary work. And these are the facts. These are the things that we can read in a bio, and these are the things that we can find, and it's available for everybody to know. But I think what it makes, in my view, the work of Christopher so intriguing and fascinating is this is something that I think many people are thinking these days and trying to figure it out, how we can navigate our own identity, cultures, and traditions, but not in a nostalgic way, not in a romantic way, not in a passive way, but in a very proactive and progressive and looking forward. And I think his work navigate those in a fascinating way, and like very few architects I can think that in practicing today can do. There is a kind of exuberant appetite for beauty and design and quality, but mostly and fundamentally is the work of an architect. It's a work of architecture for more on the front and in the back, in the sense of what all represents to be architecture, which is a catalyst for culture, but it's a catalyst for the now, and it's a catalyst for the future, and it's a catalyst to understand the history, but to move forward. So as I was saying, it's very difficult to think anybody better to start our spring lecture series than Christopher Cornelius. So it's a true pleasure to have him here. I'm very much looking forward to see your fantastic work. So please join me in welcoming Christopher Cornelius to SCI-Arc.
Thank you, Hernán. Warkuf nuela du Chris Nyongetsak wahoniwa gita loda okele oniata duwaga don choda. So I said in Oneida that I extend my greetings, love, and thankfulness to all of you. I am Chris Cornelius of the Wolf Clan and people of the Standing Stone is the earth that I come from. As mentioned, I am a citizen of the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin. I grew up on the Oneida Reservation in Wisconsin, went to undergrad at UW Milwaukee, went to grad school at UVA, started my teaching career there, and now I'm the chair and a professor of architecture at the University of New Mexico. I started my practice Studio Indigenous in 2003. It'll be 20 years in May, when I was asked to be on the design team for the Indian Community School of Milwaukee, which I'll show you in a second. I started to think about how I was going to use my culture throughout my architectural education. I value my architectural education. I think is one of the best kinds of education you can get. Where else can you develop an idea, defend that idea, get it critiqued, improve it? And I always thought this was what I certainly wanted to do. Since I was 14, I wanted to be an architect. So as I was learning these kinds of lessons in architecture school, I was beginning to think about the parallels in my culture. And so when I saw this, the duck in the decorated shed, and I started to really think about what kinds of architecture were being produced for Indigenous people, particularly at the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century, I started to think about this, the duck in the decorated shed. And so most of the projects for Indigenous people I could sort of categorize in one of these or the other. One is the zoomorph, right? The buildings actually look like animals. This is the elementary school on my reservation. This was built in the 90s, so long after I'd left the reservation. But it's a turtle. The gym is in the head. It has eyes made of tile. And there are a number of buildings like this that are turtles, they're bears. They're thunderbirds, those kinds of things. So I call those the zoomorphs. The other is the pictograph, where it's just a normal sort of building form, but it has indigenous iconography applied to it. And so for me, I was thinking about both of these kinds of architecture, and that there had to be a different way of doing this. There had to be a different way of making architecture for indigenous people, because either of these things or approaches really don't indigenize the architecture itself. So tonight I'll share with you a few, there's basically 3 themes in my work, but I'll also share a few ideas about how I understand architecture through my culture. And one of those is through stories. When indigenous people see things like this land formation that is, I can't even guess how many years old it is, but it's a geological formation that most of the indigenous people of that region, their languages are at the lower left. I won't try to pronounce them, but they basically all translate into bear's ears. So if you can imagine a bear that's partially submerged and just its ears were showing, that's how the story and the name of the place begins. But it's not just about what it looks like. It's also about the stories that hold history, they hold science, they hold technology, they hold traditions, culture. All of those things are within those stories. And for me, I believe that architecture can have the same power, that we can begin to tell stories about our architecture that go beyond us as designers and users and clients beyond that. So the first theme of my work I'll talk about is called Design as Ceremony. I borrow the term from Sean Wilson's book, Research as Ceremony, because I think about it in that way, right? It's something that I have responsibility in the world of putting things into the world, physical things into the world. It has rituals, and I'll talk about some of those rituals, but it's really about that responsibility. It's not just the task that I'm trying to complete, right? It's really about how I think about those responsibilities. So the Indian Community School of Milwaukee, I was asked to be on the design team and a collaborating designer with Antoine Predock. He was selected through an invited competition. The school basically required him to have an indigenous designer. They went through a number of people. They found me, and I was only 3 years out of graduate school at that point. My graduate thesis project was about my tribe's creation story and how was I going to translate that into architecture. So this was really a fantastic time for me, to be honest, to begin to establish a practice, to begin to establish a voice. And I will say that Antoine and I were really, truly collaborative on this project. While it looks very much like a number of his projects, he recognizes me as a collaborating designer. We were always bouncing ideas off each other. I spent time in his studio in Albuquerque and working on the project. So it's a K-4 through 8 elementary school. It is situated on about 200 acres. The school is a nonprofit. The school is endowed, so students don't pay tuition to go to the school. They only have to prove Native ancestry. There's about 350 students within the school. It's about a quarter of a mile long from the head to the tail. But one of the things that we really started to do, even in the programming stage of the school, was to strip away all of the institutional names. The relationship between indigenous people and education is complicated, to say the least. It was a tool that was used to assimilate us. It was a tool to strip us of our culture and our language. But at the same time, for me at least, I believe that it is a kind of emancipation, meaning it helps us interact in the world and it helps us show the value of our culture. So we took away the institutional names. So for instance, we started that exercise in 2003. The school opened in 2007, so it's 15 plus years old. They have never, ever called the place that they eat lunch the cafeteria. They call it feast. This is migration. This is the student entrance. We have a stair from the elementary school grades to the middle school grades. That's called Earth to Sky. And they still call those things those names and have removed all of those sort of institutional names within it. This is the upper level, the second story, the 6 through 8 middle school grades. So this is where students are actually changing classrooms by subjects. But the tree columns you see here were harvested from the Oneida Nation in Wisconsin. They have always sustainably harvested the forest and the woods. Timber is really an important part of their culture. It's part of their clan structure. These trees were over 300 years old. They're white pines. So they hold stories. They hold stories of pre-European contact, and they're in the school to tell those stories to those that are willing to listen to them. So when you look at a satellite photo of Wisconsin, you can actually see the Menominee Nation. It looks like it's some sort of Photoshop glitch, right? It's that rectangle. That's because it is densely forested, and they've always sustainably forested. I think a few years ago, they actually stopped using the Forest Stewardship Council standards because their standards were actually higher. Those trees gave their lives to the school. They were brought down in a ceremony, and they were given thanks to begin to think about their responsibility within the school. So if you can imagine, most of the state, the eastern state of Wisconsin, was all Menominee land. So a lot of it could have looked like that. One of the graphics that I created was this one, where I examined everything from the surface of the site, below the site, and all the way up to the moon, to begin to really understand the fact that when we're intervening at a site level, that we're intervening in a series of reciprocities. What are the lessons from things that we could learn from within this sort of stratigraphy, right? What lessons could we learn from the animals that burrow into the earth? The frost depth of that site was 4 feet, and so what happens underneath that? Where do butterflies migrate? What patterns of birds, bees, butterflies, all kinds of things that migrate across the sky? Where's airline traffic? Where are the seasonal winds and which directions are they coming from? And where does space travel actually happen? There's satellite traffic, all the way up to the moon, to begin to really think about this entire thing. And it has a changing vertical scale. But for me, it was really a way of beginning to think about all of the responsibilities that we have within that intervening in that particular site. So one of the indigenous values that I want to share with you, and is an important part of my work, is the idea of relationality. We talk about things in our culture as if we're related to them, meaning the earth is our mother, the sky is our father, the moon is our grandmother, the stones are our grandfathers. Every living thing is related. And we use those terms to mean almost literally as if we're related to them. And so for me, this is how I think about architecture as well. I produced this graphic. The beginning of the project, we started to graphically represent cultural values like dance, the oral tradition, migration, intergenerational aspects of the school. And you can see here, I put the names of the different places on this as well, because those sort of emerged out of those cultural values. So again, the place that they entered the building is not called the lobby, it's called community. The theater is called drum. And so I began to really think about this idea of relationality and thinking about how could we think about architecture as if we were related to it. And so one of the places that I start is to think about what nature is and what we're taught about the origins of architecture, right? From Logier's frontispiece, we see the architect pointing at the architecture, the woods, the timber that's used within that. And I oppose it with indigenous architecture and how indigenous architecture was actually created to blend into nature, to be a part of that it actually is connected to it. So for me, the main differences between these two views of nature is that the one on the right, nature is seen as a resource or a commodity. It's something for me to use, to build, to advance culture, to begin to think about how I'm pushing ideas forward. On the left, it's about relationship. I'm part of this, right? How can I begin to think about architecture in that relationship? I think that one of the sort of misconceptions about indigenous architecture is that most of it isn't permanent and isn't present because it was in this relationship. Where I am now, situated now in the Southwest, most of it is permanent, right? The pueblos are still there. But the differences between these two things and our own sort of personal relationships with it, on the right, nature is mine, right? Mine to possess and to use. And on the left, nature is me. I'm actually a part of this. And so if we thought about architecture in that way too, we could begin to think about it in that relationship as part of the system and not part of the commodity. One of the other indigenous teachings that I've learned and I hear indigenous elders talk about is the idea that plants are our oldest relatives. They've seen a lot of things. They've been through droughts. They've been through good growing seasons, bad growing seasons. Some are food, some are medicine, but we refer to them as our oldest relatives. I think that we should be thinking about buildings as our youngest relatives. As architects, we put these things into the world, right? If we think about it, they breathe, they sweat, they produce waste. They can be problematic. They can consume a lot of energy. If we started to think about them as our relatives, and that they're our youngest relatives, and as designers, when we put them into the world, we do have that responsibility, almost as a sort of parental responsibility. This is how I think about architecture, and this is how I think about this particular project. I'm very fortunate to have the school still as a client of mine 20 years later. I'm working on a master plan for their entire campus. They have always welcomed me. I got married in the building. I married my wife in the building in 2014. And for me, I've always felt like that's part of the sort of relationship that I have with the project, and I'm very grateful to have that relationship. Part of this idea of design as ceremony for me is the ritual of design. And I started to make these series of models when I didn't have any commissioned work. I didn't have any sort of grants or exhibitions coming up. I just wanted to start to make things. And a couple of things that I wanted to do, it was really like the professor giving myself an assignment. I wanted to not think about things as being metaphorical. I feel like too much of indigenous architecture is trying to be a metaphor for something, right? Like it stands for this or it stands for that. What if I removed that? And what if I also removed the role of the architect? And I wasn't quite clear who, what, or anything made this thing. How did this thing actually come about? So I worked in models. A lot of them, some of them, I should say, started as sketches. Some of them started as, I just started putting materials together. I really was interested in using these kinds of materials. I was using brass, bronze, copper mesh, working on how I patina it and solder it together. And then I was using these boxes as sites. Thinking about a site as a thing that's given to us, it's constrained, it has a history, it has contingencies, and how would we begin to do that, use that or intervene in it? And I also decided that I wasn't going to use people as the scale figures. I was going to use animals. And I kind of wanted this to be sort of intentionally blurry about who or what made this thing. So this is called the moon scope. It's a place for lying and looking at the moon. This one is called bivouac. It's impromptu structure. And this is one where I just made it as the form came out of how I was making it, because I didn't want to use these sort of traditional forms, and it is a thing in my work where I don't try to replicate traditional forms or stereotypes. I try to understand the cultural values that underpin all of those. Some of these are about cladding strategies, like the one on the left. I just started to think about, what if the cladding was like an eagle's feathers? What if I started to play with the copper mesh and the moire pattern that happens when you overlay two of them? What if I made this thing inside a box that closes but can never be closed? And this one is, again, about looking at the moon, and so I had to make this moon part of it. But then they started to emerge and have their own stories. But for me as a designer, this was a time for me to stay nimble as a designer, because I didn't think about things as a project. I think about design, and I talk to my students about design as if it's like athletic performance, right? What we're doing is practice. We're doing drills. We do this again and again and again until we get very good at it. When we get a commission, that's the game. That's game time. It's time to deploy the things that we've learned. And so this work influences a lot of the work that I'll show you now. This piece is called Trickster. It's an outdoor installation I did in 2018 for a children's literature garden in Sheboygan, Wisconsin, just north of Milwaukee. I received an artist residency to do this. It won the Architects Newspaper Best of Design Award for temporary installation that year. I made this out of trees that I harvested on site. I clad it in this copper mesh. It's the same exact copper mesh I was using on the models. And just like the models, I was trying to not make it look like a thing. And its sort of subtitle is "It's not a teepee," because everyone came by while I was building the thing and asked me, "What is that, a teepee?" It's not a teepee. But that, to me, in some ways, validated what I was doing, because people associated it with indigenous form, right? But it's not my fault that the only thing that they know is a teepee. And so it defies form, it defies program. I wanted children to come to this place and tell their own stories about it, and they began to do that. And so it was there for about 2 years. It's loosely based on this model, which is from the previous series, and this model is called Bear. But when I was making these models, I started to think about this issue of how are things going to terminate? How is this going to, this thing that's sticking in the sky, what if it had hair? And what if that hair was like whiskers or something else that had intelligence that we didn't know about? And then I started to think about its association to indigenous regalia. Indigenous regalia is not just ornamental. I call it hyper ornament because it's not just about being aesthetic. It tells us things about who people are, where they came from, what they've accomplished, and what is their sort of situation in life. On the right is the headdress of a Mohawk person, part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, which my people, the Oneida, are also a part of. The reason I know that it's Mohawk is because it has 3 feathers up. If it had 2 feathers up and 1 feather down, I would know that's Oneida. If it had 1 feather, I would know it was Onondaga. That's how people identified themselves within the Confederacy. I also know that this is a chief's headdress because it has antlers on it, and our chiefs were elected. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy is the longest running democracy ever in civilization, still in existence. You can look this up, but there's evidence that the U.S. Constitution is largely plagiarized from that Confederacy. Our leaders were elected, and women. There was a group of elder women that selected the men that were right for leadership, and this is basically why I think we have the Electoral College. But for me, I was really thinking about, can architecture have regalia as well? So my friends from Spirit of Space made this film of it, and they just sent me a message one day and was like, Chris, we want to go film this thing in the snow. I said, go for it. I didn't tell them really how to film the thing, but I think that they did an extraordinary job of really understanding what the Trickster was about, because the way that they filmed it is almost like it's an animal. If you got too close to it, you might scare it away. They started to, the film really shows me things about what I was doing with the regalia. I didn't really think about that piece of regalia reflecting the pine needles, but they saw that. And as I was building this thing, I felt like when I was putting this copper mesh on it, I felt like I was building a shirt or making a shirt for a giant bear. I was very careful with the seams. I didn't want to see any fasteners because in that way, the thing started to have its own ontological system, right? It started to have this sort of being of indigeneity because I was putting that into it. And I think they did a fantastic job of making that film. In 2017, I won one of the inaugural Miller Prize awards from Exhibit Columbus. It was one of 5 practices along with Dwayne and Jenny that won a prize, and we were assigned the sites, and that particular iteration of Exhibit Columbus was basically a head-to-head competition. They selected 10 of us to compete on 5 sites. The site that they gave me was First Christian Church by Eliel Saarinen, his son Errol Saarinen. It was built in 1942. They didn't ask us to really respond to the site or context, but I began to think about that specifically. And I really wanted to acknowledge the people that were indigenous to that part of the country. Indiana, despite the irony of its name, was one of these states that was really, indigenous people were basically taken off the land very quickly. I think it was about 3 treaties that they had to had to basically cancel, and the land base was gone. But the people that were indigenous to that part of the state were the Miami or Miami people. And like many of the Great Lakes region cultures, they were they built wigwams. And so I worked with people from the Miami Center in Indiana, and they told me that the name of the wigwam is called Wikiaami. So that's what I named the piece. And so, like I said, I'm not particularly interested in replicating the form of the thing. However, I am really interested in the lessons that I can learn from that form. It was made out of saplings that were bent over into this dome shape and then clad with either cattail reed mats or bark. And so instead of bending the thing over, I decided to bend it up. And I also decided to use a sort of ubiquitous material in its frame and structure, and that is steel rebar. And then the outside are its feathers. I call it its feathers. The cladding is made out of an expanded steel. And so I wanted people to begin to think about the land that they're on, who was there. And for me, these things are really like prompts. They're there in with the intention that people will go out and seek that information themselves. They'll begin to think about the land that they're on and whose land are they inhabiting. So it's on the site in this sort of cavity within the trees. It was there for 2 years. And the top of it is angled towards the fall equinox. So on that day, the most light comes in through the top and through the door. So they've used it in that community in different ways. It was used for storytelling. There was actually a indigenous language revitalization group that went there. IMP's libraries just across the street, they used it for storytelling and things like that. So like I said, it was there for 2 years and right before they did the second iteration of Exhibit Columbus. The second theme that I want to talk about that's in my work is drawing is medicine. When we say things are medicine in indigenous culture, it's really about how does it make us better? How does it make the world better? How is it almost therapeutic in a way? And so for me, this is one of the rituals of design. Most of my projects start with a drawing. They start in my sketchbook. I began to realize that I was trying to get out of this mindset of the architect mindset of like, I thought of the thing and now I'm going to represent the thing. What if the thing actually came out of the representation? What if it just came from me moving my pencil on the paper? So I've never erased anything in my sketchbooks. I just draw over them. I think that we draw how we think, meaning like ideas are not fully formed at the beginning. They might become more concrete to us and we darken them in or I watercolor them. And so some of these are project ideas, project sketches, and even travel sketches. So I'm always drawing. They don't always end up looking like that, but I begin projects by drawing. And so when shortly after I finished the model series, I started to think about drawings and how they can participate in this realm of keeping myself sort of nimble design-wise. And I also thought about this idea of things always being a metaphor. So I started by doing a series of drawings that are based on my tribe's moon calendar. So I call them the moon domiciles, meaning that they're based on the moon. And our calendar has names for each of the moons, and they're usually tied to ritual or ceremony or things that are happening. So some are about planting, some are about harvesting, some are about resting, some are about storytelling. But I wanted to make the structures again that weren't like metaphors for the moon, right? They weren't just tied to in that way. They're only numbered in the order that I did them. I did them kind of out of sequence. Really what I felt like I was most inspired by, I started with. So this is the second one. It's called Maple Syrup Moon. It's nothing to do with maple syrup, but however, it's based on the wind data from my reservation at that time. And it's really kind of not about that, to be honest. It's about the piece. And so I decided to draw these all 4 elevations. They're all the same form, meaning they take up the same volume. They're displaced from the ground. They have tops. They address the sky in a particular way. They have these antennae. They may communicate with one another. Some you can get into, some you can't. Some are easy to get into, some are more difficult to get into. So they started in my sketchbook in this way, and I started just drawing them in these elevations and watercoloring the elevations. As I was making these, I was also making digital models of them. And I originally started making the digital models so that I could cast the shadows and the watercolors correctly. But then I started to think, what if I started to render these differently? What if these changed the way that I was rendering architecture? And what if, for instance, in this image, what if I rendered this from the wolf's eye point of view? What does a wolf see? And in this one, instead of having columns that hold it up, it's like hair that holds it up. It's like structural hair, like a porcupine. And so what if the wolf is so close to this thing that it's almost poking it in its eye? What if the wolf can see things in the sky that I can't see? And I started to render those kinds of things and beginning to think about that as possibilities of these pieces. This one won the K-Rob Prize for best physical delineation. This one, its structure is a bundle of sticks. And it has a reservoir in it that harvests water. So the bear pulls that out in order to irrigate the landscape. So these started to emerge as their own sort of narratives in the design. The ways that I was designing it was actually part of the narrative and the way that I built the narrative. And I began to realize that the way that I was building the narrative is tied to the ways that indigenous storytelling kind of works. Meaning that when someone tells a story, it's kind of up to the storyteller to what they emphasize or what they de-emphasize. And it's up to the listener to understand the lessons or to be entertained by the thing, right? Like, so if I'm thinking about how it looks is one thing, but if I start to think about what does that mean, that might change over my lifetime. It might change when I hear a story as a child versus as I hear a story as an elder. This one is Thunder Moon. It has an apparatus at the top because the first clap of thunder in our culture, that clap of thunder wakes up the trees, and the trees then know to give sap. And so sometimes that clap of thunder might happen while we're sleeping. So I might need to hear that, like a deer hears its prey, because it needs to do that. For me, when I'm doing these kinds of drawings, if it comes into my mind, I put it in the drawing because I don't want to be the one to edit that out as an idea. I'm trying to use other parts, cognitive parts of my mind that are not just tied to like thinking of the thing, the designed object, and then representing the designed object and what that actually means. So those things can end up in these drawings. And then in this rendering, similar to the previous one, what if there were things in the sky that others can see, or other non-human relatives can begin to see? The last theme I'll share with you is decolonize and decolonization. And for me, I'll be clear about what it really kind of means. Real decolonization is about the dispossession of land from indigenous people in the U.S. and Canada. So for decolonization to really happen, land has to be given back. And land can be given back in a number of ways. It's not just only with deeding land back, but that's probably where it should start. But what if it was about the stewardship of land? And what if it were about small pieces instead of large pieces? What if the vacant sites in Detroit were started to be given back to the people that were indigenous to that land, and they were the stewards of that land? What if our national parks, the stewards of those lands were the indigenous people that had existed in those landscapes for thousands of years? But I write it in this way with a hyphen because I think of it as an active project. For me. And I think that there are other forms of colonization aside from the settler colonialism that I just referred to. I do believe that there's intellectual colonization. I believe that there is a sort of mythology that we've all been told about. Christopher Columbus came here. This was empty land. Indigenous people were almost like the wildlife. This was all wild frontier. The Pilgrims came. All of that stuff is all a mythology that we were sort of given. And so, what if we started to think about to really be honest about the history of this country and the land that it's in? So I was asked to do a permanent land acknowledgement at Lawrence University in Appleton, Wisconsin. They asked me to design this piece that would serve as an acknowledgement of the fact that their campus is on Menominee land in Wisconsin. This piece won an honorable mention from the Best of the Design Awards this year for social impact. But when you look at the land base of Wisconsin and the Menominee people that are previously referred to, that land base goes as far south as Milwaukee, and it's a big, large portion of the state. And the campus lies basically in the heart of this. And so they allowed me to select where this piece was going to go. I selected this plaza. They renamed the plaza a Menominee name. My piece is called Otāēciah, which means crane in the Menominee language. For me, I worked with a friend who's Menominee to name the piece. I wasn't thinking about it like replicating the form of a crane, but the crane in the Menominee culture is part of their clan structure, and that clan is in charge of art and architecture. And so for me, I felt like that was appropriate. The other thing I wanted to make sure was a part of the piece was its name being in the Menominee language. Like Wikiaami, I think that people should be speaking the language because the land needs to hear it. The land hasn't heard the language for hundreds of years, and it has heard the language for thousands of years. And whether it comes from an indigenous person or non-indigenous person, that's really what's important. So it's made out of this, it has a steel frame, a weathering steel cladding, and it has a pattern, custom perforation pattern that's similar to a pattern in the Menominee culture that's on the cladding. So the students, I worked with the indigenous students on the campus to begin to get some ideas from them and to think about what this thing actually meant to them. And it was really an extraordinary experience because really thinking about indigenous students on a campus that is a sort of small liberal arts campus, like many other sort of liberal arts campuses, but they don't see themselves in that, right? They don't see themselves in the physical landscape. They don't see things that are reflecting of their culture or places that they can go and gather. So students have used this thing on the campus. They've used it for a demonstration about missing and murdered indigenous women and girls. They've used it as a gathering spot for when they greet other indigenous students on the campus. This particular campus is interesting in that it has a program called College Horizons, which reaches out to indigenous people all over the U.S. And so they actually get a lot of indigenous students from across the U.S. To the campus. And this piece was completed in August of 21. It was dedicated on Indigenous Peoples Day in October of 21. And one of the things that wasn't really intentional, but is really, I think, an amazing thing that happened with the piece is that the perforation, I didn't think about it and its effect within the space. You can see here where light comes through it, it actually projects the pattern into the space. It will project it onto your body if you're inside it. And for me, it was important that people could get inside this and actually use it as a space. So for me, when I talk about it as a permanent land acknowledgement, a verbal land acknowledgement is really like a way of apologizing to say, I'm sorry, this is what I did, this is what happened. But in reality, we have to think about the steps beyond that, right? Like, how am I going to change my actions now beyond that? So this university decided, okay, we're going to have this physical thing. There are other steps beyond that, right? And I think that colleges and universities are places that have unique land relationships that we could begin to think about how could land be given back to indigenous people in that way, right? What if you hired an indigenous architect to design your chemistry building? And what if I had the ability to then show you what that actually meant in the physical landscape? What does it mean to be in a particular place and reflecting people? So for me, the idea of the land acknowledgement needs to go back to beyond the statement and go into giving land back or beginning to think about how we could think about the land that we're particularly on. I recently completed this piece called Not My HUD House. I was one of 5 practices asked to build a full-scale prototype for Crystal Bridges Museum that addressed housing, and I wanted to address indigenous housing. This one won the Best of Design Award for Temporary Installation from the Architects newspaper, and it's based on the HUD house that I grew up in on my reservation. This is the Google Street View of that house, and I will say that this is a much improved version of what I actually physically existed in. Because what I began to really think about, and have been thinking about for a long time, is that the HUD house that I grew up in has been deployed across the U.S. and across Canada. And I'm not saying this to be facetious, it's almost exactly the same house. It's the same, like, 3-bedroom, 1,200 square foot ranch home. And it has no regard for the environment, climate that it's in, right? So Here, this is a graphic that one of my Yale students put together because I taught, our site was on the far right in Manitoba. I had students designing housing for the Otāēciah Cree Nation, but I started to explain to them that these houses are all over. And so they started to look, and this student found one in Arizona, and then one in South Dakota, and then this is mine from Wisconsin. It's the same thing, right? And so my piece is different than what my HUD house is. And so I think about it as having the things that my HUD house didn't have. Now, this is a floor plan. I think it's from South Dakota, but it's almost exactly the floor plan of the house that I grew up in. I will say that this one's a bit of a fancier version because it has a master bath and it has a place for a washer and dryer. But you can see this house, and like the house that I grew up in, doesn't have a porch. We didn't have a garage. I didn't have a dishwasher until I was in grad school, and I had to ask my girlfriend at the time how to use the thing, right? And there's really no reason for that, to be honest. And what my Yale students started to see about the communities that they were looking at, when you look at a satellite view of that indigenous community and just a few blocks over where the suburban community is, there's just a complete lack of care, right? There's no driveways. This doesn't have a driveway. Mine had a driveway, but there's no sidewalk. There was no trees. That tree is new. That wasn't there, when we existed there. There was no place for me to study. There was no place for a fire. There was no view of the sky. How was I supposed to succeed coming out of this environment? Even though I wanted to be an architect, how was I going to begin to do that? So I started to think about how can I add those things into this? To think about not just like what is a new form of this thing, but to think about how do I put those things into this new housing prototype. My house didn't have a space for my non-human relatives. What if this one did? So I started to think about this idea of the hearth, and this is again where I take my architectural education and Semper's 4 elements, and I start to think about what that means in indigenous culture. That hearth is that place for the fire. And so instead of building a literal hearth, I built this frame that basically sort of symbolizes where the hearth would be or where that fire would be. Because fire in our culture is not just a thing for heat and utility, but it's also a thing of ceremony. It's a thing that we gather around. It's for gathering, and it's for socializing. It has many uses, and the HUD house I grew up in didn't have one. Its entrance faces the east. Most indigenous dwellings, that's the case, because the sun rises in the east. This is where we greet our visitors. And so it has these little sort of shelves on it. I don't know that it's happened yet, but that's a place for my non-human relatives, the birds, to be able to nest on the thing. I will say while I was building the thing in the summer, there were deer tracks up to the platform, and I didn't see any more. So I think that a deer actually did go in it. But that's fine. I think for me, I'm really just trying to think about how can I be a good neighbor to those non-human relatives. This house has regalia. My house didn't have regalia. This house has this copper sheathing. This is the copper mesh that was on the Trickster. I did a second Trickster actually for an exhibition. I keep the copper mesh, and I put it on this to begin to think about the idea that, even going back to Semper, right? The woven wall it's in our DNA. It's part of how we've always made structures and began to think about them, and thinking about that regalia and how it's put on this. This project had a great fabrication partner in Ignition Arts. They made this thing as a flat pack house. It's basically all CNC'd, arrived on the site as 3 pallets of plywood. But part of that process of making the flat pack ended up having these tabs on the exterior that hold the sheathing on. So I decided I wanted to index that index by putting these jingles that are part of an indigenous woman's dress. And usually they're very closely clad on the dress so that you could hear the women when they dance or when they're walking. This one has views inside and outside. I designed it as a sort of modular thing because I began to think about that floor plan of the ranch house that I grew up in. And it has a living room, it has a dining room, it has bedrooms, meaning that there's one space and one function. But in indigenous space, it's really just about everything in a way, right? It's about gathering, it's about eating, it's about government, it's about religion and ceremony. What if I started to think about these spaces as that? The other thing that HUD housing doesn't help us with is that Indigenous families can grow and shrink very rapidly. So while I was in high school, my grandmother's husband, my step-grandfather, passed away, and she actually lived with us for like 3 months. I slept on the couch, she slept in my bedroom. But that's what we had to do because this is normal, right? It's normal for Indigenous families, if you have an adult child and that child has a child, you could have 3, you could have 4 generations within a home. So this is designed in a way that it's modular. What if the community could come together, build a module and add it on? I could add a bedroom. And what if the most expensive part of the home, the bathroom, plumbing, heating, cooling system, was actually one of those modules as well? So this is the inside of the big module, and that's where the view to the sky is. So many cases in Indigenous dwellings, that view to the sky also had a purpose. It was usually the way that you get smoke out of the space. To me, that's ingenious because we think about how we could build a fire within a space that didn't completely fill with smoke. It has to do with the way that the door is situated or other sort of ways of venting into those spaces. But this one has different apertures so that the space is animated by light throughout the day. I started to think about what if we rendered this in different seasons and how would my non-human relatives use it? There's a snow owl that's on the hearth, and maybe that raptor is using it to stalk its prey in the snow. And how can that facilitate the home? So that piece is still there at Crystal Bridges in Bentonville, Arkansas. To begin to understand colonization, I borrowed these terms from Linda Smith's book called Decolonizing Methodologies. And she breaks the vocabulary down into 3 terms. The first term is the line, the map, the survey, right? So the 13 colonies, the Louisiana Purchase, and then that gets surveyed and turned into states. That is the first step of colonization. The second is the center, right? The orientation to the system of power, the capital. Italians put churches in the middles of their cities. But it's about establishing that power through establishing the center within that territory that you've now sort of claimed. And then this idea of the outside, that territory and people are in oppositional relationship to one another. We're inside, you're outside, this is our country, stay out, build a wall, keep them out. Like that sort of way of understanding land and space is part of colonization. But the thing that really struck me about these terms is we use these in architecture all the time, right? They don't literally mean the same things, but we think about these things. And the ways that we push colonization forward is when we're reinforcing these systems, right? And so for me as an administrator of a program, if a student comes to me and says, look, Chris, I didn't get a C+ in my studio and I can't go to the next studio now because my grandfather died. Well, I have the power to say, okay, you can go, but make sure you talk to your professor. I'm trying to do that because for me, when I was an architecture student and these things happened to me, no one gave a shit about my life, right? And I'm trying to give a shit about their lives. And so that's where these lines are, right? These thresholds, the gates. Our grad students, when you get into the graduate program, that should be the only gate, right? Right? You got into the program. Now go and excel. How can I make a system that helps you excel? And so I think about these things, and I think about them in the ways that I make things and the ways that I draw things. But I will say that the thing that I think colonization is fueled by, is perpetuated by, is reinforced by completely is a lack of empathy. If we lack empathy, we're not thinking about each other's situation. We're not thinking about the fact that our situations are very different. I don't assume that every single one of you got to SCI-Arc in the same way. Like you shouldn't assume that I got to the position that I'm lecturing at SCI-Arc in the same way, right? I don't make those kinds of assumptions. You may be an international student that it was very difficult for you to even be here, but you decided to come here. Or you might be someone of privilege and it's a place you wanted to go and your parents can afford it. it doesn't matter, right? We're all in this together. And so how can we be more empathetic as designers? This is what I'm trying to really think about. And when I say that, I also mean our non-human relatives. I really do. As architects, we spend a lot of time trying to keep birds off our buildings. Why aren't we making buildings that are also habitats for them? Why aren't we thinking about how these buildings are situated or where glazing is? Buildings are the second leading killer of birds aside from predators. Why aren't we thinking about those things? So it's just simple things, right? But I do think that it boils down to empathy. And how can we begin to think about ourselves as being empathetic designers and the things that we're putting into the world? So this last project I'll share with you is a research project that's been going on for several years. I started it as a grant proposal that was funded from my previous institution. And it examines the American Indian occupation of Alcatraz Island, which happened from November of 1969 to June of 71. So about a 19-month occupation of the island. And this is a time when Alcatraz was decommissioned as a prison and before it became a national park. So it was in the federal land surplus. And a group of students from the San Francisco area, I don't think they were all from University of San Francisco, but a group of indigenous students decided they were going to occupy the island based on the Treaty of Fort Laramie that the U.S. government made with the Lakota people. In that treaty, the U.S. government said, any land we deem as surplus, you can have it. So that Alcatraz Island was surplus, so they wanted to take it. They convinced a gentleman to give them a boat tour. They hired him to take them on a boat tour around the island. When they got about 3/4 of the way around the island, they jumped off the boat and they swam to the island. The only person on the island was a caretaker, one person that worked for the Department of Interior. The thing that I was really, and people have written about this history, and it's really an important history of indigenous resistance in this country, but the thing that really compelled me was they didn't want the island for like political or economic gain. They wanted an indigenous university, indigenous cultural center, indigenous ecological center. They wanted architecture. And that, to me, was really amazing. And so this grant proposal that I wrote, I supposed that they got what they wanted, and I was going to design the indigenous university on this island. One of the things that's really important and is still there on the island is the graffiti. And if we think about different sort of movements and resistances, rhetoric is really important, right? Black Lives Matter, #MeToo. These are things that people rally around. So this is a piece of graffiti that's in one of the buildings on the island. But the other thing that they did when they occupied the island, they really tried to erase, in a way, all of the references to the United States and that the federal property that it says United States property, and so they crossed out the states and put Indian and put on you're on Indian land. Indians welcome. So during that time, people could come to the island. They were supported through a nonprofit that was created. It is a sort of remote place, so people would donate cash and food and clothing. They basically ran a school during that time on the island, and there was a radio broadcast called Radio Free Alcatraz. That's where I get the title for my project that happened on the island every day. And the poet John Trudell was the person who ran that radio show. When I began this project, I started to really think about the complexities of what had actually happened and the long history that had happened that led up to that particular moment. So I decided that I had to draw differently, and I had to really think about how projects start. How was I going to integrate this research that I was finding, the things that I knew about the island, the things that I knew about the occupation, which has been written about in a historical perspective, but not really from this sort of architectural perspective. So I decided I was going to create thematic drawings, and this one is called Trajectories. And so any way that I could think of the term trajectory, I drew it. So where I started was all of the buildings on the island, I drew every edge of every building. Just using the same instrument, I drew every edge of it off. And then I started to think about other trajectories, like the wind, the sun, the ferry traffic. I started gathering all these maps. Part of my grant was on-site research, and I went to the Golden Gate National Park Archive. I pulled out all of these maps that showed me all these sort of historical things. I started to think about things like how the West Coast was surveyed when it became a place that the government was interested in. They used this very large triangulation system. There was no GPS system at the time. When I was there doing my research, the America's Cup was happening, so I traced the race of that on there. So again, if it comes into my brain, I put it into the drawing. I draw these on Mylar. I draw on the front and the back. What you're looking at is about 3 different sheets that are overlaid with one another. I put tape on them. I cut holes in it. But I really started to think about like this idea again that as a designer, all of this information is coming in, and instead of trying to edit it out, I was only using the filter of trajectory. If it was a trajectory, I put it into the drawing. These kinds of drawings, they take me about 6 weeks to do. I would say 60 to 70% of my time is looking for stuff. And then I sort of trace it and put it into the drawing. One of the things that's on the lower layers of this, I started to think about, okay, there has to be a layer that is just about indigeneity. And this one is showing different kinds of trajectory. One is the Trail of Tears. So in the bottom right, if you thought about where Florida is, and the people that were indigenous to those landscapes, Florida and the Carolinas, were literally walked to what we call Oklahoma. It was called the Great Indian Territory. It was on the edge, right? It was like, this isn't the U.S. yet. Let's put these people and make them literally walk. So many people died during that time. Many people settled in different areas. Arkansas is one of them, where the Trail of Tears actually goes through. Another image on this is the Four Corners in the Southwest. New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, Colorado. This is before there were any states. This is a sacred place where you can see the alignment of 4 mountains. So many of the indigenous origin stories talk about emergence from that particular place, and Chaco Canyon is there. And then the trajectory of my people, the Oneida, we're indigenous to New York State. And a small group of us moved from New York to Wisconsin in the 1820s. We were the only one of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy that supported the American effort in the Revolution. That became very politically challenged because the other people in the Confederacy wanted to support the British to sort of preserve their trading relationships with the British and French. So that turned out to be problematic. So in the 1820s, we moved to Wisconsin, and the path that we took from New York State is basically through the Great Lakes into this area in 1822, before Wisconsin became a state. So this drawing is trajectories. This drawing is called territories. So anything related to territories, I found geological maps, landscape maps, all kinds of versions of those maps. The graffiti is in this, beginning to think about how territories are claimed. So any way I could think about territories and how they're claimed. And so the beginnings of this is, for me, related to the design of the university, which I'm planning to site on the southern end of the island. There are building footprints there. So after the occupation, the U.S. government came and tore down those buildings. Alcatraz has a really interesting history, but when it was a fully functioning prison, this is a weird thing. The guards, their families, all lived on that southern end of the island. So with the most dangerous people just on the top of the hill here, right? That always perplexed me. The warden's house is at the top. So people were living in those basically like dormitories, and they tore them down. So that green area is Taos Pueblo. I started to think about the ideas of pueblos as centers. Each of these places have those centers to scale. And then the Chaco Canyon is drawn on there to scale as well. And this one, the idea of territory, looking at the land secession, and secession is a fancy word for stolen. Today happens to be the anniversary of the Dawes Act. I think it's 1887. So in 1887, the Dawes Act allotted lands to tribal members. So I just decided to show 2 territories. The Great Lakota Nation, which is this big sort of area here. So this is before the Dawes. All of this is actually before the Dawes Act. And then Wisconsin. So when my people came to Wisconsin, we came with Episcopalian and Methodist missionaries, but we purchased that much of the state, bought it. With the Menominee people, we purchased that land. Then the government came in and said, well, you can't have that. You can have the smaller piece. Then we purchased that land. So then we were existing on land we had purchased twice. 1838, the federal reservation boundary was established, and the same thing happened to the Lakota people here. Each time the government comes in at a new time and says, you can't have that, you can have this, and you can see that it shrinks. The yellow sort of vinyl pieces are the federal reservation boundary. So in 1838, our reservation boundary was established, and we purchased that land. We're now existing on land that we'd purchased 3 times. Then the Dawes Allotment Act happened, where they gave any lands that weren't already claimed to every tribal member, including children. And this was a policy. This is when the U.S. government had stopped, not even completely stopped, to be honest, but had decided, I should say, to expand its aggression towards indigenous people beyond a military sort of thing, and to start to use policy. So if we allot every tribal member a piece of land, now you're a landowner, and we're making you assimilated like normal people. So you have to pay tax on that land. Well, that's never communicated to any of these indigenous people. And so when they didn't pay the tax, then they took the land, then they sold it to non-indigenous people. My reservation has a county line that runs through it. It has an entire incorporated municipality within its boundary. It overlaps Green Bay proper, and it also overlaps the airport that's in Green Bay. It's a very complex sort of political history. So we don't, even though we purchased that land 3 times, we don't own 100% of it. At one point, we only owned about 2% of it. And I don't know exactly what the figure is today, but any land that becomes available, our tribe tries to purchase it. But there's just no way we'll ever own 100% of that land because of other things like the Homestead Act and other sort of things. So all of that happened before Wisconsin became a state in 1848. And that's part of this drawing. And so this was my way of understanding all of these things and sort of graphically representing them. Also in this drawing, I think about places like Acoma Pueblo. When we're talking about architectural history, we should be talking about this, right? These are the first cities in the U.S., not just Acoma, but Cahokia, other places. This part of this mythology that this was a wild wilderness is false. It was a highly managed landscape with very sophisticated political systems, infrastructure. The first multi-story buildings are here, and they're still standing. They're still there, right? So we should be learning lessons from those as architects, and we should be talking about them in our architecture schools. We should be talking about Chaco Canyon and our building technology schools, right? This is masonry that rivaled what the Romans were doing, and there's just no way they could have communicated with each other. They learned how to make round masonry buildings. They learned how to make apertures that were aligned with the sun and the moon. They learned how to make lintels. So all of that technology was part of this. It's more square footage than any skyscraper that was ever made in Chicago, long before that, right? And so we should be talking about those things within our architecture classes as well. So in this drawing are also petroglyphs. I happen to be a part of in the part of the country where there's a lot of petroglyphs. There's a group that are 3D scanning them to kind of preserve them, but they're ways of claiming territory, so they're in this drawing. Then I had to really think about how was I going to address and express and think about the more difficult parts of our history, meaning the history of the United States and indigenous people. So I decided to index it with this date here, 12/29/1890. On this day, this is a massacre at Wounded Knee. More than 300 indigenous people were shot by the U.S. Army, completely unarmed. They were dancing in a ceremony. The leader of the tribe was saying, well, if you keep dancing, the bullets won't hurt you. They were completely gunned down. So this is the end of December. This is how this was documented. This is the United States Army right here, right? These gentlemen received medals for this. Of those 300 people, most of them were women and children. The men were out fighting the army in other places. They dug this mass grave and they put them in the earth. Now, I don't know about you, but this looks like genocide to me. This is only one instance. And for me, I think it's time for us to be honest about the history of this country. This is one of many difficult truths, but not in a way that I'm not trying to cast blame or guilt, but I just want us to be honest about it, right? So when I'm teaching these students at Yale and I'm talking about indigenous land and why you can't own the land, and then halfway through the semester, I'm like, why do I have to teach you so much about indigeneity? And then I told them, I was like, it's not your fault. It is not your fault. The system has failed you. Your K through 12 education failed you. Your undergraduate education failed you because it sold you this mythology. For me, I believe that every undergraduate architecture student should take indigenous history. You should know the policies that led to the relationship of land that we have and what actually happened. But I also think that we should just be honest about things like this, right? That these things are the difficult parts of our history. They're really the things that we have to wrestle with. Now, for me, it's just about telling the truth and then deciding what am I going to do about it, right? So when the Dakota Access Pipeline happens, they get an archaeological report that says people are buried in that landscape. It's not just about contaminating the water, and they push it aside and ignore it. That's problematic, right? That's problematic, and it's problematic that we don't know that, but it is a part of our history. So I'm trying to wrestle with these things, and so this is an ongoing project. It's really now in this sort of massing phase. Anytime it's really like a research project, and when I have time, I go back to it, which I haven't had time. But I really want to think about this university. What does it mean to educate indigenous people in the 21st century? How is that different? How is this building different? How can it actually be like an animal? And not just in its materiality and how it presents itself, but how can it exist on that island in that way? How do indigenous students get to the island differently than the ferry traffic? How can it coexist with the national park? How can it coexist with the migratory birds that land on that southern end of the island? So that's really the things that I begin to think about. But these three themes that I've shared with you, design as ceremony, drawing as medicine, and decolonization, this is what fuels me as an educator. My former students don't know it, but I've always thought of it this way, and I've always been thinking about it, even though I wasn't teaching them specifically indigenous content. I was teaching them these indigenous ways of thinking. So I'll leave you with this. This is the two-row wampum belt. You can see the date here, 1613. This is the agreement between the Mohawk people and the Dutch. They got to the point of their relationship where they decided that they had to learn how to coexist with one another. They both were trading throughout what we call now the U.S. So the Dutch wrote a treaty. They signed it. Indigenous people signed it. But the Mohawk made this wampum belt in order to signify that treaty. So to them, it has the same power. The two rows that you see here are the two canoes, the Mohawk and the Dutch, the indigenous and the non-indigenous. And they're equal. They're parallel. There's not a competition, and that's what they decided to do. And so when I think about my indigeneity and my architectural education, that's how I've always been thinking about it. These two canoes, I'm standing on both canoes. As an administrator, it's always been important to me to be a good architect, to be a good professor, to be a good teacher of architect, to teach responsible young people how to put architecture into the world. I'm also indigenous. Sometimes it's very difficult for me. Like even when I'm examining my HUD house, I have to think about, I haven't even told you the whole history of what happened in that house because I can't. But when I'm standing on both of these canoes and the waters get rough, I have to pick one. I can't stand on both of them, right? I have to get into one. Sometimes it's the indigenous canoe. Sometimes it's the non-indigenous canoe. But I have to be able to coexist in both of those worlds. So this is how I've always been thinking about my architectural education and my culture. How can I bring them together? They're not in competition with one another. They're intended to go forward together. Yawako, thank you.